So, what's the future of leadership and the workplace? Find out more on this episode of Communicate for Impact Live.
Welcome to Communicate for Impact Live, sharing stories and making connections. We are Douglas and Lisa Marie Hatcher, co-founders of Communicate for Impact, a business storytelling, training, and coaching firm just north of New York City. And today we are delighted to welcome management consultant, keynote speaker, and author, Dan Eds. Dan, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Dan, we're super psyched to have you on. Let's dive into your book. It's called Leveraging the Genetics of Leadership, Cracking the Code of Sustainable Team Performance. I want to start with a really simple question. What what got you started? What inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, great question. Sometimes I think I wish I hadn't been inspired because it's become a bit of an obsession. It has become an obsession. But what really inspired me, two things. One is, in 25 years of consulting, working with a lot of government agencies, nonprofits, healthcare, K-12 education, higher education, and several other kinds of firms too. Um, I began to see about the 20-year mark, something was going on that was behind the scenes that I couldn't put my finger on. I would invariably meet senior executives of these organizations, many of them whom had all of the traditional traits of a great leader: visionary, great communicators, outstanding people skills.
Mhm.
And then because they asked me to start working with their organization and their staff, I start working with their staff. And invariably I find they're exhausted, they feel underappreciated. They have little engagement with the organization other than going to work, collecting a paycheck, going home. Um, the most common thing that teams and workforce staff that would tell me and doing these engagements was, we've been through this before. The problem is they don't want to listen to us. And so another something happened. There's actually many conversations, but something happened about 8 or 9 years ago now. Sort of began to crystallize everything for me. A very large state agency had asked me to come in and do a lean engagement for one of their larger team of about 55 or 60 people, and they put together this group of this team that was going to be involved with this engagement of about 18, 19 people. Spent 4 days with them, and at the end of 4 days, we had two, I must say, gorgeous value stream maps laid out on the wall. um, 4 days was intense. It was exhilarating. It was exhausting. At the end of that time, we had four really well designed, um, fairly easy to execute initiatives that would uh, basically allowed their staff to go home on time. We're coming out of the recession. Everybody was feeling tired. They'd had massive layoffs. No reduction in their workload though. And at the end of the very last thing, um, I, s- I watched this guy. He was about 6'3", 6'4", and weighed 250 pounds. One of their more experienced managers walked up to the director of the organization, and I'm not joking, lifted him up on his toes by the lapels of his sport coat. No exaggeration. Physically shook him and said, if you don't do something with this, don't ever ask me to help you with this kind of an activity ever again.
Wow.
And
So
so
I, I,
that,
I know Lisa Marie's got a question, but let me just jump in on this. Dan, we're thinking about the great resignation and the great reflection and all this really important stuff that's happening in the workplace now. But I'm really glad you mentioned the financial crisis, 2008, 2009. It feels like this has sort of been trending for a while. Talk about that for a second, and then I think Lisa Marie's got a question.
Sure. I think it's been trending for a long time. Um, but in the last couple of years, the power shift has changed.
Yes.
So, coming out of the recession, anybody who had a job was happy. In fact, one of the guys that was on this team I was working with, he had a significant position with a local firm. Um, he could have led the lean workshop that I was doing because he knew that much about it. He actually was in charge of one of the lean initiatives in a major corporation. He got laid off. He had taken a job as a like a financial clerk because he needed the benefits. And I can't tell you the number of times that in conversations with this team, I would turn around and I would look at the senior managers and they're staring at this guy. They had no idea what they had in him. They were totally clueless. And but now the power has shifted. People are saying, I don't particularly feel like I want to go back to work again. It's
Right.
demeaning. I don't like the people I work with. I don't like my managers. I'm there. I'm a paper pusher. I'm a cog in a wheel. I'm tired of that.
Yeah.
And if they don't have to, they're leaving. It's
Yep.
that simple.
That's a good point.
So, Dan, tell us a little bit more about looking at leadership from the standpoint of from the organization versus the individual.
Sure. Well, if you look at the literature on leadership, invariably it comes down to a series of personal traits or attributes. And there, I describe the leadership literature in two ways. Either a book is about here's how I did it, and if you followed my formula, you too can be on my path of greatness and fame. And it's really all about establishing, my personal legacy, but it's couched in the language of leadership. The other kind of book on leadership is, here's the formula. If you, if you follow what Abraham Lincoln did, or Nelson Mandela, or Martin Luther King Jr., then you too will be a great leader. And as I got looking at those books, and I've read a bunch of them, at some point I realized no combination of Jesus Christ, Nelson Mandela, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all of the greats, it would be impossible to model half of what they were. And the formula doesn't work anyway. It worked for them.
Mm-hmm.
It worked for them in their time and in their situation. And so I began to think there's got to be a different way of looking at this thing called leadership. And came across a woman who teaches at Harvard. Barbara Kellerman is her name. She, I believe, is the founding chair of the dean of the School of Public Leadership in the Kennedy School of Government. She points out that nationally we spend $50 billion a year on leadership development, and there's not a shred of evidence that has any organizational value. One of the reasons why it doesn't have any value to the organization is because of prevailing systems. There is a prevailing system of leadership in every organization. If you want to call it a culture, I won't disagree. But there is a way of doing leadership in every organization. And so I began to think, well, how do high impact organizations do leadership? And what I discovered was that they approach it very systemically. They approach it as a way of developing their culture. And if someone chooses to lead in a way that's inconsistent with their culture, inconsistent with the system, the way of doing leadership that they want, they are quietly showed the door. It's that simple.
Mhm.
Is there a quick example that you can give us from your book? You've got a ton of great stories.
Yeah, where do you want me to go? Manufacturing. So let me tell you one of my favorites. Is actually with about an elementary school principal. Now, you might have some people on your audience go, elementary school principal, what do they know about leadership? They're leading kids, right?
Right.
What can be hard about that? Um, but I would argue that if you took the CEO of one of the largest banks in the world and put them inside an elementary school for 5 minutes, they'd be running back to their bank. This woman, it was her first principalship. And she didn't want it when she started out her career. She didn't want to be an educator. It was the last thing she wanted to do. But went through the ranks, did everything she needed to do. Eventually became her turn to be a principal. And she was given two choices: one school in a neighborhood of high economics, high academic achievement, high academic expectations. The other one was a school of high poverty, low academic achievement. In fact, academically, the school was the lowest performing school in the district. Expectations was not high. The prior principal had been run out of the school because of the teachers union. There was open strife within the ranks, and there was a lot of folks in the school that just didn't like each other. And she came in, and in 5 years, it went from the lowest performing school in the district to the highest performing school in the district. And then over the next 2 years, it actually broke the achievement gap, broke the achievement gap, which is an unheard of accomplishment. That's the gap between rich and poor, majority and minority. It is a huge accomplishment. And when I sat down with her, I said, I want to talk to you about your approach to leadership. And she actually did this. Leadership? I don't know anything about leadership. She went on then and to describe for me her approach to leadership was amazingly systemic. It developed a culture. She wouldn't even known that she was developing a culture, but that's what she was doing.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got done, I said, your system that you're talking about and the way you're describing it is the most eloquent system of leadership I have found outside the United States Army, with 2 million active and reserve duty personnel.
Wow.
And it wasn't that she was yelling and screaming at people, exactly the opposite. She knew how to love people.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what was attractive, and that's what changed her culture.
You said in the book, you were quoting General McCaffrey, and you said the same thing. Quickly comment on that if you would, and at least I think
Oh,
that's a
wow.
question.
Yeah. 3 years later, I'm still reeling at the 1 hour conversation I had with him. But it was exactly a duplicate of an earlier conversation I had with another guy who was a full colonel, U.S. Army Ranger, served mostly with the Special Forces. When I was talking with McCaffrey, it was just mind bending. And when he said, I said, how does the Army approach the practice of leadership? Same question I asked everybody. He immediately said, we practice servant leadership. And the next words out of his mouth, he's talking to me about love.
Mm-hmm.
And I was blown away. In fact, I didn't even hear what he said clearly until I was reading the transcript. And he's talking to me about General Norman Schwarzkopf during the first Gulf War.
Yeah.
And he said Schwarzkopf actually loved me. And I didn't hear that when I was talking to him, because I was just so focused on him.
Right.
I'm reading the transcript. And I said, did he really say that? But then I started looking at some of the Army core values, and the prevailing word that kept coming back to me was the Army teaches their officers, their soldiers, how to love each other.
Wow.
Yeah, and take care of each other.
She worked at the Pentagon very early in her career.
You did, Lisa Marie?
Yes,
Oh,
very
really?
early in my career.
Okay.
Like first job out of college, early in
Okay.
my career.
Okay.
I was there about a year. And I worked for, I reported to both the civilian side as well as the military side. So a 3-star general and a director. So it was a great experience. But I want to go back to where you were talking about workforces being so exhausted and feeling so unappreciated. How can your book help leaders address that?
Well, the book addresses leadership as an organizational system. And so one of the components of the system is routines. Every system on the planet, man-made, nature-made, operates on a series of routines as well as rules. Um, and so what I've done in the book is provided examples of rules and routines that high impact organizations uh, coach, teach, train, and expect every leader to follow.
Mm.
And they are unrelenting and uncompromising. Um, I'll give you just one example. A healthcare organization in Mississippi, 2012, it won the National Malcolm Baldrige Quality Awards, the
Mhm.
nation's highest award for excellence. And in my interview of the CEO, he said one of the first things he did was he began to require every one of his leaders to do rounding. Now, there's other ways to describe that. The word rounding really comes out of the healthcare community. There's a lot of different words for the same idea. It basically means management by walking around.
Yeah,
Get your rears out of your desk, out from behind your desk, and go visit, work with your people side by side. Spend time with them.
It's what makes a
And
general a general,
yeah,
right?
and so he required that, and he made it very clear for every one of his leaders that is your priority. Your schedule is to wrap around that priority. And funny
that's
comment,
amazing.
when he was telling me this, I said, "So, what did your leadership team think when you started rolling this out?" He kind of laughed. He said, "Well, half of them got up and walked out." And he said, "I found out later that the other half was thinking I would eventually get up and walk out."
You know, when I was at Mastercard, I was the speechwriter for 5 or 6 years for then CEO Ajay Banga. And Ajay is one of the great examples of the kind of leadership that you're talking about. And he always talked about managing by walking around, and he
Mhm.
did it.
Yeah.
Um, a great historical example of that, not necessarily walking around, but really checking in with people
Mhm.
in during the Kennedy administration, President Kennedy was known for routinely calling mid-level staff at like
Mhm.
the State Department if he wanted to find out what's really happening in, you know, South America. Well, pick a country in Brazil. He would
Mhm.
call the person at the desk at the Brazil
Mhm.
desk and say, "This is President Kennedy. I want to ask you about X, Y, and Z." I mean, it not only keeps people on their toes,
Mhm.
but it makes them feel valued and
Yep.
appreciated.
Yep.
And management by walking around doesn't have to mean literally walking, but it does mean being visible and checking in.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's various ways of doing that. It's in the book. I don't say here's how to do it. What I do say is here's some case studies, here's some organizations, and here's how they did it. Um, the way a healthcare organization would do that is different than a manufacturing organization.
Right.
But the principle is the same. Um, get out on the shop floor with your staff. Go visit people. Spend time with them. And as you pointed out, you will learn more about your team and your organization spending 10 minutes with them side by side than you will ever learn in a staff meeting.
Yes. Good point. Um, there is a famous basketball coach who took that kind of interest in his players to the extent that he would every season begin the same way and teach his players how to put on their socks.
Mhm.
Mm.
That coach was John Wooden, and
Yep.
I gotta tell you, Dan, you began your book and you ended your book with John Wooden and talking about the UCLA coach legend. Tell us about Coach Wooden and his contribution to this conversation.
Well, I could talk longer than we have time for, but he's legendary for what he did and what he accomplished. He's legendary for the fact that he never yelled, never screamed, never swore, abhorred foul language. He quoted poetry. He was a throwback many generations. Yet he produced, was it 7 consecutive or 8 consecutive national
Yes.
championships,
Yep.
a record that probably will never be broken. And I read and studied him probably 40 years ago, and then in the book I started reading, his stuff again. What struck me though is that he had a specific way, let's call it a system of how to play the game of basketball.
Yep.
It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the design of a system that gave them the best opportunity, gave every player the best opportunity to be their best. And he was uncompromising and unrelenting in how to do that. There's a great story that I read about him. I can't remember the player, but he was a freshman and he was highly recruited, and he was coming down the court in a game one time, and he did a fancy behind the back pass, and he got pulled from the game.
Yep.
And he was angry, and later he told Coach Wooden, that's why you recruited me to play like that. And Coach Wooden said, no, I didn't. And he pulled. The story goes, he went into a desk, rummaged through a bunch of 3x5 cards, came out and said, that pass has a 70% chance of being successful. If you do it the way I coach you to do it, it has a 90% chance of being successful. Don't quote me on the numbers, but it was something along that line.
So he was using data analytics long before it was the thing.
Yeah. But that's the beauty. When you think of leadership, in a systemic way, all of a sudden it opens up that world of, well, how are we doing?
Wow.
If we want leadership to produce employee engagement, and the national numbers on employee engagement haven't changed that much. Basically, 2/3 of all employees don't care about their organizations, or they are actively sabotaging their organizations. If we were to start applying those kinds of data to leaders and saying, you are responsible for the culture and the engagement of your team, I think we would get a dramatic change in engagement numbers. We'd also get a dramatic change in attitude, in the excellence and the expertise that people are bringing to their job. If you think about it, and this is one thing that motivated me to write it, as I got thinking about it and looking at it and doing the research, at one point I was getting really angry because I was saying companies, organizations of all types are hiring people because of their technical skills.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Totally ignoring everything else. And the school principal I mentioned, about halfway through the conversation, I said, it sounds to me like your approach to developing your people is really focused on developing the whole person as opposed to just the professional bits.
Mm-hmm.
And she looked at me like I was from outer space, and she said, well, of course, why would I want half a teacher walking in my door?
Brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
And the same thing could be said for a nurse, for a doctor, for a communications expert, for a computer programmer. And yet we treat people as if they are just a half a person. And when we think of what an organization can do to develop their people holistically, they open up enormous, unimaginable capacity within their workforce. Just by saying, our workforce are people, they're human beings. They walk in the door with enormous, unimaginable capacity for service, for sacrifice, for creative thinking, for innovation. and they are willing to give all of that to us for free,
Yes,
absolutely for free.
Not to mention the loyalty that it creates.
Absolutely.
great point.
Yeah.
Getting back to Ajay Banga, I met when he was at MasterCard, he, long before other people started saying this, he would say, bring your entire self
Mm,
to work.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Yep.
I know Lisa Marie is going to get us into some closeout questions. But one thing I just want our viewers to think about, and Dan, for you to sort of comment on quickly, is I wonder if this kind of thinking impacts how we should look at succession planning. What
Mm,
I mean by that is we typically think of, I'm the CEO, I've got to have a succession plan, which means how is someone going to succeed me? And I bet your take on this is no, it shouldn't be how do they succeed you, but how do they build on the system that you've created?
um, Douglas, I
Just
can't I can't say
comment,
any
just
better.
comment on it.
I can't say any better. Now, here's the beauty when you think of leadership as a system, you can begin to train people to the requirements of that system. And some are going to be better at it than others. Um, but when you start training people to the requirements of the system itself will replicate itself. And that's one of the key features of a system. Systems replicate themselves. They do it naturally.
Yeah.
Um, and I would just use the United States, or probably any military, but for our conversation, the United States military, as an example. When was the last time you saw the Army go outside of the Army for its senior executive officer? They
Yeah.
don't do it because they have a way of doing leadership that's different than the Marine Corps, different from the Air Force,
Yeah.
and different from a bank. They want leadership done the Army way. Right or wrong, good or bad, you're going to do it the Army way. And the better you are at it, the higher you will move up the ladder.
Right. Lisa Marie, why don't you take us to some closeout questions?
Okay, so we always ask 2 closeout questions for our guest. And question number 1 is, Dan, please share with us something that you've learned in the last 6 months that might be helpful for our viewers today.
It's a great question. And this is, it's not something that I've learned in the last 6 months, but it's been growing. And maybe like, okay, maybe like in the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's just sort of, I guess it clarifies in my mind, but it's really this idea. If we want to develop high impact organizations, the only way to do that is to think about culture, which in fact rests on a platform of leadership. I define a high impact organization as one that produces both high engagement of their employees, let's call it loyalty if you want to call it that,
Sure.
as well as unimaginable, unparalleled customer value.
Yes.
I found an organization that has customers standing at the door wanting to do business with them because of the value that they provide their clients. The only way we get both of those things, high employee engagement and high customer value, is looking at the organization systemically and building their culture, which rests on that platform of systemic leadership.
That is awesome. Second closeout question, Dan. Is there a challenge that you're facing where one of our viewers might be of help to you?
Sure. Yes. So in the last year or two, I've been winding down the consulting that I have been doing because I want to spend the rest of my life and my career working with organizations in their leadership and in their culture. There's a lot of talk from people about leadership and culture, but if I may say so, they're not looking at it in a way that's systemic. And I believe that when you look at leadership and culture as an organizational system, culture being the output of that system, that we can in fact change the world. We can change the workplace, dramatically improve the workforce, dramatically improve value delivered to customers, And so I'm looking for customers. Um, I'm looking for organizations that are saying, we need to improve our culture. We need to improve our leadership, and we want to create models of leadership and culture that we can, in fact, then begin training our potential leaders the day they walk in the door.
That sounds
And
great.
and so when it gets time for the CEO to move on, there's somebody right behind them to continue that tradition, continue that systemic development of culture and relationship and culture and leadership.
That is super.
Wonderful. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. This was wonderful. For our listeners and viewers today, we will be sharing a recording of this interview on our website at communicate4impact.com. And if you want to reach out to Dan, you can link in with him at Daniel Eds on LinkedIn, or you can go to his website, which is danieleds.com. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe and stay well until we see each other again.
Thank you so much.